It is time, I believe, to attempt to answer the militant feminist critics of the Swamp Thing. He cannot or will not speak for himself. Such silence is characteristic, and therefore I have taken it upon myself to be his wholly unauthorized advocate. I want to emphasize that I am not an attorney, and he has not retained me or sought my assistance in any way. This is purely a voluntary effort on my part, driven by my concern for the poor, and I believe misunderstood monstrosity. The claims and accusations directed against Mr. Thing are not unexpected, nor are they astonishingly new. In the past, they've been leveled at Tarzan the Ape Man as well as King Kong. It should be obvious that one of these creatures is a gigantic primate, while the other was raised by apes and partook much of their savage nature. So in estimating the protests of these women, we might well reflect on their very clear anti-animal bias. And we might also note how safe it is to direct our fiercest rhetoric against isolated creatures who cannot defend themselves. Finally, it bears mention that Tarzan eventually arrived at a state of happy, stable, passionate matrimonial bliss with his fully consensual partner, Jane, which any person, regardless of gender, might envy, while, in the case of King Kong, when the dust had settled, it was beauty killed the beast, not the other way round. Those are not insignificant points to bring to the table, even though avid rhetoricians dislike being confronted with the cold, hard facts. As to the particulars of the Swamp Thing, I should perhaps present the full case of the militant feminists. Even as I do, I would like to suggest that this is a perspective, not a final judgment. They see him hip-deep in murky water, walking away through cypress trees, cattails, vines, and creepers. In his arms is a screaming young lady. Though greatly distressed, she is undeniably beautiful. Her hair is a sight, and her blouse is torn. Physically, however, she appears to be unharmed, though in immediate jeopardy. As Mr. Thing continues to ignore her pleas and wade through the bilious liquid matter of the swamp, her cries grow fainter and fainter. She beats her hands on his chest and recoils in horror at his visage. The two of them eventually disappear into the tangled, fetid morass of the swamp, where unimaginable horrors presumably await the terrified female. I believe that fairly represents the militant feminist view. They say with complete confidence and conviction that a woman has been carried off against her will. They say, pronouncing judgment with the voice of doom, that the monster is guilty of abduction as well as rape, forcing a woman's compliance regardless of her desires. While appearance seems to support the conclusion and the verdict, nothing could be further from the truth. Let us examine the truth, painful as it may be for some. The truth is that the Swamp Thing is indeed carrying a protesting, might I say hysterical, woman away in his arms into a dark, damp, mysterious quagmire. But away from what, we should ask? Away from harm, even though she is not aware of it. The creature, if we must call him that, is attempting to take the woman to safety. Far from wanting to harm her, he is operating on her behalf. He persists despite her strenuous protests. He realizes that she is unaware of the threat and is also driven to emotional extremes because of her immediate contact with him. She finds him repulsive, to say the least. Consider him. She is correct. He is gross, disgusting, fantastic, a monster by any standard. He knows this. No one knows it better than he. He feels the painful emotion that can only be felt by those who have undergone extreme and irreversible disfigurement. Look at his body and try to picture his soul, the torment he must feel every waking moment of his life, and in his sleeping ones too, for even in his dreams, unrelievedly, he is a monster. He also knows something else, a feeling which is difficult to communicate because it cannot be known by any but Mr. Thing. He knows he is the only one of his kind, now and forever. There will never be another thing with whom he can share his sorrows or his joys. He is truly solitary in his being. Furthermore, if this drastic isolation were not enough, He is persecuted and hunted by those who created him. I ask you to reflect on who the monsters really are. Because of his appearance, he is also feared and hated by those who judge him on his hideous form. He is trapped inside a prison he neither made nor deserves. Is it any wonder he seeks companionship of any kind? Is it any wonder he might wish to share his wretched abode, the swamp, with some other living soul? But he does not take some innocent and weaker human being to gratify that need. No, he takes her because her fate becomes enmeshed with his. She comes into the way of danger, and he seeks only to remove her from possible harm. He is not a monster. He is a savior. Though she seems trapped in his arms, she is actually being rescued from the devious clutches of rapacious land developers, cruel drug smugglers, and even the merciless, unrepentant forces that created Mr. Thing in the first place. Instead of condemnation for this poor beast, we should strike a medal. Short of that, could we not muster one small tear of pity or remorse? And as long as we are striving to confine ourselves to the facts of this investigation, let us make note of the utter lack of complaint, formal or otherwise, that has emerged from these so-called abductions. Yes, a chorus of voices has been raised to protest the harsh treatment of these women who have been seen in Mr. Thing's arms. But how many of the women actually involved have registered a personal alarm, much less a criminal charge, following the incident? Not one. The conclusion is obvious. Despite his awful appearance, his terrible odor, his clamminess, all of the descriptions of his person which are undeniable, and for which he is not responsible, this fact emerges: to know him is to pity him. More, to know him, to really know him, and not just judge him by his appearance. To know him is to love him. Yes, we may be bold enough to ask, where is romance? What has become of chivalry? What happened to a woman being swept off her feet? Is it no longer possible? Does it constitute an abridgment of her rights as a person? What a shame. Women may now stand firmly on their own 2 feet, but at what cost? Alas, they may never know. The knights in shining armor have been dismissed. Children are not persuaded to snap judgments like adults. They can see past the hideous body, and they judge Mr. Thing not by his looks, but by his actions. And their judgment, it is nearly uniform. They believe him to be a good guy. They would run screaming from a clean-shaven banking executive before they would flee from Mr. Thing. As for the women who have been seen in his arms, screaming for their fear of their very lives, to a lady, they support him. Each one of them, when asked, calls him misunderstood. Some go further and say he has been falsely slandered. They remark of his tenderness and gentle compassion, qualities one would hardly expect from such an obvious monster. They mention his manners, his shy courtliness, even a certain savoir-faire. The inescapable conclusions? There are several. One is that the obvious may not really be so. It is an old lesson, but one that seems must be constantly relearned. Looks can be deceiving. Another is that the solidarity of the sisterhood may be more rhetorical than factual. Women should demand to be treated as individuals, not as a class. Mr. Thing in particular treats women with respect and sympathy. If you do not believe it, ask the ones who would know. Finally, on behalf of Mr. Thing, I would urge and appeal on everyone. Think before you act. Do not believe everything you hear. Examine something carefully and firsthand before you arrive at a conclusion which otherwise might come back to haunt you. For example, the swamp. Is it nothing but a site to be drained and cleared for a future shopping mall? Or is it a fragile ecosystem, his habitat, his home? Never before have we been saturated with so much information, and so much of it is distorted and false. Though the experience of being carried away in Mr. Thing's arm may have been disconcerting at the time, in retrospect, when all the factors involved have been examined and rightly understood, the women have come to feel that it was, by far, the luckiest and happiest experience in their lives, a truly signature and unforgettable moment, save for the unfortunate blouse, which somehow always seems to get torn.